When Michel de Montaigne wrote that the moment you stop worrying, everything begins to fall into place, he was not offering comfort. He was issuing a warning disguised as wisdom. Modern culture has transformed worry into a permanent background noise, something we carry as proof of responsibility, intelligence, and control. To stop worrying feels dangerous, almost immoral, as if vigilance itself were the thing holding reality together. But Montaigne observes something far more unsettling. Worry does not protect us from chaos. It often creates it. The human mind is not designed to solve imagined futures endlessly. It is designed to respond to reality. When we obsessively anticipate threats, failures, and losses, the nervous system reacts as if those events are already happening. Stress hormones rise, perception narrows, and judgment deteriorates. Ironically, the more we worry, the less capable we become of responding effectively when something actually goes wrong. Montaigne lived in a time of war, plague, political instability, and sudden death. His insight was not born from comfort, but from exposure to uncertainty. He noticed that people who tried to control everything through anxiety suffered more, not less. They mistook mental tension for preparedness. Letting go of worry does not mean becoming passive or careless. It means releasing the illusion that constant fear improves outcomes. When worry loosens its grip, attention returns to the present moment where action is possible. Decisions become clearer, reactions faster, and mistakes easier to correct. Order begins to emerge not because the world becomes kinder, but because the mind stops fighting shadows. This is why stopping worry feels like collapse at first. The ego believes it is the guardian of survival, and fear is its tool. Removing that tool exposes a deeper intelligence beneath it, one that responds instead of panics. Montaigne understood that peace is not something added to life after problems disappear. Peace is what allows problems to be dealt with intelligently. The paradox is brutal. Everything starts to fall into place only after you accept that you cannot force it to do so. The moment worry ends, clarity begins. Worry does not arrive as noise, it arrives as logic, dressed in concern, and this is why Montaigne treated it as one of the most deceptive habits of the human mind. He observed that people rarely suffer from reality itself, but from rehearsals of reality that never happened. The mind builds futures as if they were certainties and then reacts to them emotionally, as if they were already real. This creates a paradox where the body experiences stress without an external threat. And over time, this simulated danger becomes indistinguishable from actual harm. Modern neuroscience confirms what Montaigne sensed. Intuitively, when the brain imagines a threat, the same neural circuits activate as if the threat were present. Cortisol rises, muscles tense, attention narrows, and the nervous system shifts into survival mode. The tragedy is that most of these imagined futures never occur, yet the physiological cost is fully paid. Worry, therefore, is not preparation. It is premature suffering. Montaigne warned that the mind addicted to anticipation loses its ability to live because it is always elsewhere, either ahead of time or behind it, trapped between regret and fear. When you worry, you are not solving problems, you are feeding uncertainty with energy, and the mind rewards this behavior by producing more scenarios, more doubts, more imagined outcomes, until worry becomes a self-reinforcing loop. What feels like responsibility is often disguised avoidance, because worrying creates the illusion of control without requiring action. This is why stopping worry feels dangerous. At first, because the mind equates letting go with negligence, but Montaigne argued the opposite. Clarity emerges only when the mind is no longer occupied by ghosts. He wrote that nothing torments us more than our own judgments, and this applies directly to worry, since it is judgment projected forward. Unchecked worry fragments attention pulls consciousness away from the present moment, where life actually happens, and replaces it with hypothetical narratives that have no grounding. This weakens decision-making because a mind flooded with imagined threats cannot see real options. Clearly, freedom, therefore, does not come from eliminating uncertainty, but from learning to coexist with it. Without panic, when worry loosens its grip, the mind regains flexibility, perception widens, and action becomes possible. This is why many people report that when they stop worrying, solutions appear seemingly on their own, not because reality changed, but because perception cleared. Montaigne understood that peace is not produced by perfect conditions, but by a disciplined relationship with thought. When you stop feeding anxious projections, they collapse from lack of attention, and in that silence, something subtle happens. Order begins to emerge, not because you forced it, but because you finally stopped interfering. At some point, the mind stops asking questions and starts building stories. Not stories meant to understand reality, but stories meant to protect the ego from uncertainty. This is where fear becomes convincing, not loud, not dramatic, but logical. It explains why you should wait, why now is not the right moment, why you are not ready yet. The brain loves patterns, and when it cannot predict the future, it creates simulations. These simulations feel real because the nervous system reacts to them as if they already happened. Heart rate changes, muscles tense, attention narrows. Nothing is happening, yet the body behaves as if danger is present. This is not intuition. This is imagined survival. Carl Jung warned that when imagination is not anchored in reality, it becomes autonomous. It no longer serves you. It starts directing you. You believe you are thinking, but in truth, you are rehearsing fear. The mind repeats the same future scenes again and again, hoping that repetition will create control. It never does. It only creates exhaustion. Over time, you begin to confuse these imagined outcomes with truth. You say things like, "I know how this will end," or "I have seen this before." But what you have seen is not reality. You have seen your own unresolved past projected forward. The brain uses memory as raw material. Old failures, old rejections, old shame. It reshapes them into future threats. This is why fear feels familiar. It is recycled emotion. Jung called this identification with the shadow of the future. You are no longer responding to what is in front of you. You are responding to what once hurt you. And the most dangerous part is how reasonable it feels. Fear does not scream. It explains. It sounds like wisdom. It disguises itself as responsibility, caution, realism. But life does not happen in simulations. It happens in contact, in action, in exposure to the unknown. The longer you live inside imagined outcomes, the weaker your capacity for real experience becomes. You stop trusting direct perception. You start trusting predictions. And predictions are always biased toward what you fear most. The way out is not positive thinking. It is grounding, returning attention to what exists. Now, sensation, breath, movement, reality interrupts fantasy. Jung believed that consciousness expands only when we stop identifying with our thoughts and begin observing them. The moment you see a thought as an event rather than a command, its power weakens. You are not your fears. You are the space in which they appear. And that realization is not comforting. It is liberating. At some point in this journey, something subtle but irreversible happens. The questions stop being theoretical. You no longer ask who you are as an idea. You begin to feel the weight of who you have been pretending to be. This is where most people turn back, not because the path is unclear, but because it is too clear. The mind begins to recognize patterns. It can no longer ignore repeated choices, repeated failures, the same emotional reactions playing out in different situations with different faces. You start to see that your life is not random. It is structured. It follows an internal logic, and that logic has been operating quietly beneath your awareness for years. Carl Jung warned that the unconscious does not speak in words but in repetition. When something is not made conscious, it returns as fate. That fate is not mystical. It is behavioral. It is emotional. It is neurological. You choose similar partners. You recreate familiar conflicts. You sabotage progress at the same moment every time. Not because you want to suffer, but because the psyche seeks familiarity before it seeks health. The nervous system prefers the known. Pain over the unknown, freedom. This is the prison most people never realize they are in. They believe they are making choices while unknowingly obeying old internal commands written by childhood experiences, unresolved. Fear, unspoken shame, emotional conditioning. You can hear this prison in the language people use. I always end up here. This always happens to me. People are always like this. These statements sound like observations, but they are confessions. They reveal an internal script running in the background. This is where self-awareness becomes dangerous, not empowering. Dangerous because once you see the script, you are responsible for it. You can no longer blame coincidence or bad luck. You are forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that part of you has been participating in your own limitations. Jung called this moment the encounter with the shadow, not the shadow as evil, but as rejected truth. The shadow contains impulses you were told were unacceptable: anger, need, desire, ambition, vulnerability. These qualities were not destroyed, they were buried, and buried things do not stay quiet. They leak out through passive aggression, anxiety, depression, addiction, overthinking, emotional numbness. The shadow does not punish you, it compensates for what consciousness refuses to hold. This is why moral perfection is so dangerous. People who try to be only good unconsciously give their shadow permission to act without restraint. The more rigid the persona, the more chaotic the unconscious becomes. True, integration is not about eliminating darkness. It is about recognizing it, owning it, and giving it a conscious role in your life. When anger is acknowledged, it becomes boundary. When desire is accepted, it becomes direction. When fear is faced, it becomes intuition. This is the turning point. Most people stop here. They understand the concept. There is a moment after awareness when the mind tries to negotiate. It says, now that I see the pattern, I can control it intellectually. This is another illusion. The nervous system does not respond to insight alone. It responds to experience. This is why people can understand their trauma perfectly and still repeat it. Jung understood this deeply. He believed that true change does not occur in the thinking mind, but in the lived psyche. The body must learn what the mind already knows. Until then, insight remains sterile. This is why transformation feels physical, not metaphorically physically. The chest tightens when you choose differently. The stomach resists when you set a boundary. The heart races when you walk away from something familiar, even if it is harmful. This resistance is not weakness. It is evidence that you are leaving the known territory. The brain evolved to keep you alive, not free, and survival is based on prediction. The familiar is predictable, even pain. When you step outside the script, the brain signals danger. This is where most people retreat. They mistake discomfort for a warning. They return to old habits, old relationships, old identities, and call it intuition. But intuition is quiet. Fear is loud. Jung warned that the greatest risk is mistaking unconscious fear for inner wisdom. This is how people build lives that look stable but feel empty. They obey the internal alarm system instead of questioning it. The real work begins when you stay present inside discomfort without acting it out. You do not suppress it. You observe it. You allow the anxiety without numbing it. You allow the urge without obeying it. This rewires the nervous system, not instantly, but gradually. This is how the psyche learns that change is survivable, that authenticity does not equal death, that abandonment of false identities does not mean annihilation. This is also where solitude becomes essential, not isolation. Solitude, spaces where no performance is required, where there is no audience, where the persona collapses naturally and the real self has room to breathe. Jung spent long periods in deliberate withdrawal, not as escape, but as integration. He knew that the psyche needs silence to reorganize itself. Without silence, the unconscious cannot speak. And when it cannot speak, it acts. This is why constant stimulation is so dangerous. It prevents integration. It keeps you fragmented. But when you slow down, patterns surface, memories return. Emotions arise without clear cause. This is not regression. It is processing. The psyche finally has space to finish unfinished business. Most people interrupt this stage. They distract themselves because the emotions feel overwhelming. But this is the doorway. This is where the prison begins to crack, not because you force it open, but because you stop reinforcing the walls. There is a moment that comes after awareness, but before change. It is the most unstable phase of all. You see clearly what is wrong, but you are not yet strong enough to act. This is where many people turn back. They mistake clarity for completion. They believe that understanding the pattern is the same as breaking it. But insight without action only sharpens the pain. Jung warned that consciousness enlarges suffering before it reduces it. Because once you see you are responsible for what you tolerate, the excuses stop working. The old stories sound hollow. You can no longer honestly say, I did not know. And so a tension builds between who you are and who you pretend to be. This tension manifests physically. Restlessness, tightness in the chest, chronic fatigue, anxiety without a clear object. The psyche is preparing for a crossing. This is the stage where people often seek distractions, not because they are weak, but because the pressure is immense. It feels like standing on the edge of a cliff. You No, you cannot stay where you are, but you cannot yet imagine the ground below. This is why Jung emphasized patience, not passive patience, but active endurance, the ability to stay conscious without numbing yourself, the ability to sit with contradiction without escaping. This is extremely rare. Most people resolve inner conflict by collapsing back into habit or leaping impulsively into a new identity. Neither is integration. True change is slower. It requires allowing the old self to die without immediately replacing it. This is psychologically terrifying because identity feels like survival. But identity is not life, it is structure, and structures must sometimes collapse to make space for something more flexible. In this phase, relationships often strain. People who benefited from your old role feel threatened. They may accuse you of changing, of becoming selfish, cold, distant. What they are really reacting to is the loss of control. When you stop playing your part, the system destabilizes, and systems always try to restore equilibrium. This is why guilt intensifies just before liberation. Not because you are doing something wrong, but because you are breaking an unconscious contract. Jung noted that individuation often begins with loneliness, not social isolation, but existential loneliness, the realization that no one can walk this inner path for you. This is also when projections fall away. You stop expecting others to save, validate, or complete you, not because you become hardened, but because you become grounded. This phase feels empty, but it is not emptiness. It is space, and space is dangerous only to identities built on noise. If you endure this phase without rushing to fill it, something remarkable happens. A new orientation emerges. Not an answer, but a direction, not certainty, but coherence. You begin to act not from fear or approval, but from alignment. This is the quiet beginning of freedom, not dramatic, not visible to others, but internally. Unmistakable. The prison does not collapse all at once. At some point, clarity turns into obligation. This is where the real danger begins, not the danger of collapse, but the danger of half change. You now see the structure of your prison. You understand the mechanisms, habits, beliefs, relationships, and fears that keep you contained, and yet a subtle temptation appears, the temptation to renegotiate with the cage. Maybe you tell yourself you can stay a little longer. Maybe you convince yourself that small adjustments are enough, that you can be more conscious while remaining in the same patterns. Jung warned that the ego is extremely skilled at compromise when its survival is threatened. It will offer comfort in exchange for stagnation. It will promise growth without loss. But transformation does not work that way. Real change demands sacrifice, not dramatic sacrifice, but specific loss. You must give up the benefits of your old identity, the approval, the predictability, the familiar suffering. This is why many people stop here. They become highly self-aware, but fundamentally unchanged. They speak the language of depth while living the same life. This creates a new prison, more sophisticated, but just as limiting. Prison of insight. Without movement, true individuation begins when action aligns with awareness. Not when you feel ready, but when you decide to stop betraying what you know. This decision is rarely loud. It often looks small from the outside. A boundary set, a habit dropped, a truth spoken quietly. But internally it is seismic, because for the first time your behavior matches your perception. And this creates a new kind of stability, not the rigid stability of control, but the flexible stability of self-trust. Jung believed that the psyche heals through lived experience, not intellectual resolution. You do not think your way out of the prison. You walk out step by step, and each step feels uncertain because the old maps no longer apply. This is where fear changes quality. It is no longer paralyzing. It becomes informational. It tells you where growth is happening. If you feel fear without confusion, you are moving correctly. This phase also reveals something unsettling. Freedom is not immediately pleasurable without the old structures. You feel exposed. You are no longer protected by roles or expectations, but this exposure sharpens perception. You become more sensitive to what aligns and what drains. You stop forcing connections that require self-abandonment. You stop explaining yourself excessively. You begin to move slower but with greater precision. This is the quiet formation of integrity, not morality, not perfection, but inner consistency. And once this consistency forms, it becomes very difficult to return to the old cage, because even comfort cannot compensate for self-betrayal anymore. This is the point of no return, not because everything is solved, but because something fundamental has shifted. You are no longer asleep, and the prison knows it. Freedom is not the end of the journey. It is the beginning of responsibility. This is the moment few people talk about, when the old prison no longer holds you, but no new structure has fully formed. You are no longer driven by fear alone, but you are not yet guided by deep trust. This creates a strange emotional vacuum. Many people interpret this phase as failure. They say nothing feels exciting anymore. That motivation disappeared, that life feels flat. But what actually vanished is noise, the nervous urgency, the constant internal pressure to perform, to please, to prove. Without that pressure, the psyche recalibrates, and recalibration feels like emptiness before it feels like clarity. Jung understood this phase well. He wrote that after the collapse of false values, the individual often experiences a period of inner desert. This desert is not punishment, it is detox. It is the nervous system learning how to exist without chains, without external validation, without constant stimulation, without identity armor. This is where many people panic and rebuild the prison. They return to old habits not because they are ignorant, but because silence feels unbearable. But if you stay, if you resist the urge to fill the void with distraction, something unexpected happens. A new signal appears, not loud, not dramatic, a quiet sense of direction. It does not tell you who to become. It tells you what to stop tolerating. This guidance is subtle but precise. You feel it when something is misaligned, and for the first time you listen. This is the emergence of the inner compass, not intuition as fantasy, but intuition as grounded perception. You begin to sense when you are about to betray yourself, and that sensation becomes intolerable. This is how integrity is born, not as a moral rule, but as a biological response. Your body reacts to lies, even polite ones. This also changes how you relate to others. You become less impressive, but more real. Some connections fall away, not because of conflict, but because the contract is broken. You no longer perform, and some people only knew how to relate to your mask. This loss can feel brutal, but it creates space for relationships that do not require self-erasure. This is not a happier phase, it is a truer one, and truth has weight, but it also has gravity. It pulls your life into coherence, and once that process begins, it cannot be stopped. At the end, there is no grand revelation, no final transformation, no permanent state of peace. There is something far more valuable. You become real. The prison was never external. It was built from adaptation, fear, and the need to be acceptable. Once you see that you cannot unsee it, and once you stop feeding it, the walls slowly dissolve. Not all at once, not without discomfort, but permanently. Jung never promised happiness. He promised wholeness, and wholeness includes doubt, fatigue, fear, and contradiction, but it also includes agency. You are no longer driven blindly. You choose even when choice is hard. This is the dangerous truth about yourself. Not that you are broken, not that you are weak, but that you are complicit. You maintain the prison because it once kept you safe, and releasing it means accepting uncertainty. But here is the paradox. The uncertainty you fear is lighter than the certainty that was killing you. Freedom is not comfort, it is alignment, and alignment gives you something no prison ever could: the ability to live without splitting yourself. If you take nothing else from this, let it be this. You do not need to become someone new. You need to stop abandoning who you already are. That is the exit. That is the work. And that is why most people will never leave But you already saw the door, and seeing is enough to begin.